The doctor's office, Beverly Hills, 1979. The waiting room was the specific kind of waiting room that Beverly Hills medical practices produce, not the waiting rooms of the ordinary medical establishment, with the plastic chairs and the outdated magazines and the specific quality of anxious, undifferentiated humanity that such rooms contain. This was a waiting room with different chairs and different magazines and a different quality of anxiety. The anxiety of people who have the resources to be seen by the best available, and who are therefore in the specific position of people who know that what is coming from the best available is the best available answer rather than the approximation that lesser resources would produce, and who are waiting to hear it. James Coburn had been waiting for the answer for several years, not in the literal sense of the waiting room, in the longer sense of a man who has been experiencing something in his body and who has been attributing the experiencing to the explanations that the experiencing permits before it no longer permits those explanations. The stiffness, the specific quality of pain in the mornings that the morning's activity gradually reduced as the joints warmed and the day began. The pain in the hands and the wrists that was, in the earlier years of its appearance, something that the physical demands of the career provided a plausible explanation for. He was an action star. He had been an action star for nearly 20 years by 1979. And the physical demands of being an action star for 20 years are real demands on a real body. And the specific discomforts those demands produce are real discomforts that a man of 51 who has been performing his own stunts and moving his body in the ways that the action films required since the early 1960s would reasonably attribute to the accumulated physical cost of the career. He had attributed them to that. He had been attributing them to that for longer than the attribution was accurate. The rheumatologist's examination was thorough in the way of thorough medical examinations. The blood work, the imaging, the specific assessment of the joints that the examination of a patient with the symptoms he was presenting required. The examination produced the findings. The findings produced the diagnosis. Rheumatoid arthritis. The rheumatologist explained it. He explained it in the specific clinical language that physicians use when they are describing a diagnosis to a patient. The language of mechanisms and processes, and the specific biological events that the diagnosis names, the language that is accurate, and that is, for the person receiving it, both more informative than the name of the disease alone, and less useful than the specific understanding of what the name means for the specific life of the specific person sitting in the office. What it meant for the specific life of James Coburn in 1979 was something that the rheumatologist could describe in general terms. The progression of the condition, the specific ways it would affect the joints over time, the treatments available and their limitations. But that James Coburn was going to have to translate from those general terms into the specific vocabulary of his specific life, which was the vocabulary of a man who had built a career on the specific quality of his physical engagement with the camera. He was not simply a physically attractive man who happened to be in films. He was a performer whose screen presence was organized, in a significant part, around the quality of the way he moved, the specific, distinctive quality of his physical ease, the way the body occupied the frame without appearing to work at occupying it, the quality of natural authority in movement that the camera found in him, and that the action films had been using for 20 years. And that was, in the specific combination of joints and muscles, and the neuromuscular quality of movement that the body's ease depended on, the thing that the rheumatoid arthritis was now attacking, the hands specifically. This is the medical fact that The subsequent years would make the most visible. Rheumatoid arthritis attacks the joints, and the joints of the hands are among the joints it attacks, with the specific preference for the small joints that the disease's pattern of progression tends to show. His hands. The hands that held the guns in the Flint films. The hands that had the specific quality of large, capable, unhurried ease that the camera had loved since the Magnificent Seven. The hands were going to change. The rheumatologist told him this in the clinical language that described the change in terms of joint damage and loss of range of motion, and the specific physical limitations that the progression of the condition would produce. He heard it. He thanked the physician. He left the office. He drove home. The house was empty. Part 2. The Empty House. Beverly Ann Kelly. The name is not one that the histories of James Coburn's career tend to linger over, because the histories of careers tend to be organized around the career, rather than around the domestic context in which the career was lived. And Beverly Ann Kelly is the domestic context rather than the career. She was his wife. They had married in 1959, the year before the Magnificent Seven, the year before the career became the career. What it means to marry someone the year before the career becomes the career is something that is better understood in retrospect than in prospect. In prospect, you are marrying a person who has ambitions and who has the qualities that the ambitions are based on, and who is in the process of converting those qualities into the career the ambitions envision. In retrospect, you are looking at a marriage that was formed before the career and that had to negotiate, across its duration, the specific dynamics that the career produces in the relationship between the people who were there before it and the person whose career it is. They had 2 children, James Harrison Coburn III, known as Jimmy, and Lisa Beverly Coburn. The children were the children of the years of the building, the years in which the career and the family were both in the process of becoming what they would be, and they were raised in the specific environment that the Beverly Hills household of a working actor in the 1960s and 1970s produced with the money and the professional social world and the specific texture of the entertainment industry's domestic geography. The marriage lasted 20 years. It ended in 1979, the same year as the diagnosis. I want to stay with the coincidence of the timing, because the coincidence is not incidental to the story of who James Coburn was in the years that followed. The ending of a marriage of 20 years and the diagnosis of a progressive autoimmune disease in the same calendar year is the kind of accumulation that a single year is not usually asked to contain, and the containing of it, the specific way that a person manages the arrival of 2 major losses in the same 12 months, is the organizing fact of the years that followed. He moved. He was in a different house after the marriage ended. But the metaphor of the empty house is the metaphor of the condition rather than the specific geography. Whatever the address, the house was the house of a man who was alone, who was in pain, who was managing both without the specific resources that the domestic life had provided and that its ending had removed. The pain was progressive. This is the medical fact of rheumatoid arthritis, in the form that James Coburn's body was producing it. And the progressiveness is the specific quality of the disease that distinguishes it from the acute conditions that resolve and from the chronic conditions that are stable. Rheumatoid arthritis in an uncontrolled or inadequately controlled form does not simply produce the same level of symptoms consistently. It produces symptoms that change over time, that can intensify during flares, and that can produce, over years, the specific structural changes to the joints that the disease's inflammatory process creates. His hands were changing. The people who worked with him in those years, the directors, the co-stars, the crew members who observed him on the sets of the films he continued to make despite the disease, describe a man who was managing something that was visible in the way he held things, in the way he moved his hands, in the specific quality of physical ease that had been the camera's primary relationship with him. And that was now something he was maintaining through the conscious management of the pain, rather than through the natural expression of a body that was at ease. He was managing it without saying much about it. This is the specific quality of James Coburn's management of the disease during this period that the accounts of people who knew him consistently describe. He did not make the disease the subject. He was not the man who was constantly talking about his pain or requiring the people around him to organize around his condition. He was managing it, and the managing was something he was doing in the private space of the house and in the even more private space of his own body. And what the people around him received was the version of him that the managing produced: present, professional, the specific quality of cool that had been his professional signature, still present, still available, still the thing the camera found when it looked for it, even when the finding of it required from him the sustained effort that it had not previously required. He tried what the conventional medicine of the early 1980s offered. He was not a man who was dismissive of conventional medicine or who organized his relationship to his own health around the rejection of the medical establishment's authority. He went to the appointments. He took the medications. He followed the protocols that the rheumatology of the era had available, which were real protocols based on real pharmacology that produced real results in the patients for whom the pharmacology was appropriate. He was not, in the specific case of his specific condition, the patient for whom the available pharmacology was producing adequate results. The drugs helped to some degree and not enough. The inflammation was managed partially and not completely. The progressive nature of the disease was slowed partially and not stopped. The pain was reduced to a level that was below the peak and above the level at which a man can go about the business of a professional life without the business requiring the management of the pain. He looked for other things. This is the specific decision of a man who is not finding sufficient relief in the available conventional options, and who is therefore looking at the options that the conventional framework does not endorse, but that the non-conventional landscape contains. He tried things: the anti-inflammatory diets, the nutritional interventions, the specific alternative approaches to pain management that the early 1980s produced in quantity for the people who were looking for them. He was looking. He was in the empty house. He was 51 and then 52 and then 53 and then 54 and 55 and 56 and 57. And the pain was the condition of all those years. And the house was empty for all those years. And the career continued in the way that the career of a man of his professional standing continues when the man is managing something that the career requires him to manage around, which is not always as the career was before what it is being managed around. He worked in films that did not always require the specific physical quality that the action films had required. He was in supporting roles, and in roles that the dramatic, rather than the physical dimension of his presence was the primary resource. He was good in them. He was always good, because the goodness was not only the physical quality, but the intelligence and the timing, and the specific quality of screen presence that is not reducible to what the body does. But the career was not the career of the 1960s. not because the talent had diminished, it had not, but because the specific commercial category in which the talent had been most powerfully useful had required the physical quality that the disease was taking, and the taking of it reorganized where, in the industry's commercial logic, his talent was most useful. The house remained empty. Not forever. He would remarry eventually, and the empty house would become something else. But the years between the ending of the first marriage and the beginning of the second were the years of the bad diagnosis and the empty house together. And the together is the thing that the 9 years between the diagnosis and the night everything changed most completely contained. He was in the empty house for 9 years before the night came. Part 3. The night everything changed. He was 58 years old. It was 1988. He had been living with the diagnosis for 9 years. He had tried everything the conventional medicine of the era offered. He had tried things the conventional medicine of the era did not offer. The pain was still the condition of his body and his life. A friend told him about a man named Philip Satchel. The specific mechanism of the referral, who the friend was, and in what context the name of Philip Satchel came up, and what exactly the friend said about what Satchel was doing, is described in the accounts of the period in ways that are the ways of such referrals, which is to say, in the ways of things that happen between people who are not thinking about how the history will describe the moment, but who are simply in the moment, doing what people do when they have a friend who is in pain and who they want to help. The friend said there was a man. The man had an approach. The approach involved sulfur-based nutritional supplementation, specifically a compound called methylsulfonyl methane, which is known by the abbreviation MSM, and which had been the subject of research at the Oregon Health Sciences University by a physician named Stanley Jacob, who had been investigating its potential applications for a range of conditions, including pain management and inflammation. James Coburn was not a person who heard about unconventional approaches to the management of conditions that conventional medicine had not adequately addressed, and who dismissed those approaches without investigation. He had been in pain for 9 years, and he had tried what was available to try, and the trying had not produced the result that 9 years of trying deserved to produce. He was therefore in the specific position of a person for whom the dismissal of the unconventional is not the rational stance that the dismissal of the unconventional tends to be for people who have not exhausted the conventional. He contacted Satchel. What happened in the period following the contact is described by James Coburn in his own accounts with the specific care of a man who is aware of the controversy that surrounds the claims being made, and who is nevertheless committed to the honest account of his own experience, because the honest account of his own experience is the thing he can provide, and the controversy is the thing he cannot resolve. The MSM treatment began. It did not produce the dramatic, immediate resolution of 9 years of progressive disease in a single transformative event, because the honest account of medical treatments, even the ones that work, is that they work gradually rather than dramatically, and over time rather than immediately. He began the treatment. He continued the treatment. Weeks passed and then months passed, and the pain that had been the condition of 9 years began, not to vanish, not to be replaced by the complete absence of symptoms that the phrase recovery tends to imply, but to reduce, to become in the specific way of symptoms that are reducing rather than resolving, something that was different from what it had been. The hands, the specific focus of the disease's most visible effects, the hands that the camera had loved and that the disease had been changing, began to change again, in the direction of less limitation rather than more. He described this himself in the specific, careful language of a man who is describing something that he knows is going to be received with the specific skepticism that the alternative medical establishment tends to generate, and who is describing it anyway, because the alternative to the description is the silence about the most important medical event of his life. And the silence is not what the honest account requires. He became an advocate. He became a specific and vocal advocate for MSM and for the research of Stanley Jacob. He co-wrote a book with Stanley Jacob titled The Miracle of MSM, The Natural Solution for Pain. The book described his experience and the science behind the treatment and the specific clinical research that Stanley Jacob had conducted. The book was received with the specific combination of interest from people who were managing pain conditions and skepticism from the conventional medical establishment that the advocacy for alternative treatments tends to generate. He did not stop advocating. He continued to describe his experience in interviews in the specific way of a man who has found something that helped him and who understands that the helping of him does not constitute scientific proof of the general efficacy of the thing that helped him, but who also understands that the description of his experience is what he can offer, and what the people who are in the specific situation he was in before 1988 might find useful. The career changed after 1988. Not immediately. The recovery from 9 years of progressive disease is not the recovery that produces immediate and dramatic changes in the career trajectory. But over time, as the pain reduced, and the function in his hands improved, and the physical engagement with the work became available again, in ways that the 9 years had been taking it away, the career began to move in directions that the 9 years had not been permitting. Part 4. What came after? The Oscar. This is the fact about what came after that is the most specific and the most documented form of the evidence of what the recovery produced professionally, and it deserves the careful attention that the specific facts of what it took to produce it deserve. Paul Thomas Anderson was a young director in the early 1990s. Young in the sense of his career, not in the sense of his talent, which was the talent of someone who was not early in the development, but fully formed in the specific way of directors who arrive at their professional form with a completeness that does not require the decades of development that the formation of some directors requires. He cast James Coburn in Affliction in 1997. Nick Nolte was the lead. Coburn played Glenn Whitehouse, the father. Glenn Whitehouse is not a character of simple villainy, though he does terrible things, and though the things he does are the specific things that fathers do when the pain they are carrying has not been addressed, and has instead been directed outward toward the people closest to them. He is a man of a specific kind that James Coburn had not been asked to play before. A man in whom the capacity for cruelty is the specific expression of the incapacity to manage the pain that the cruelty is the outlet for. He is, in the specific moral vocabulary of the film, not evil, but damaged. And the distinction between evil and damaged is the distinction that the performance is required to communicate, and that the performance communicates because the performer is giving it something from somewhere real. What James Coburn gave Glenn Whitehouse was the specific quality of a man who has been in pain, not the theatrical quality of performed suffering, not the calculated presentation of a character in distress that the technique of acting can produce in a performer who has not personally experienced the specific kind of distress being depicted. The quality of a man who knows what it is to have something in the body that is not manageable and that requires from the person managing it, a constant expenditure of energy and attention that leaves the person depleted in ways that the people around them experience as the effects of the depletion rather than as the depletion itself. He knew this. He had known it for 9 years before the night everything changed, and the knowing had not been erased by the recovery. The recovery had reduced the pain. It had not removed the knowledge of what the pain had been. The knowledge was there, available for the performance, and he gave it to the performance with the total commitment of a performer who has understood what the role requires and who has the material to give it what it requires. The Academy Award nomination was announced. He was 69 years old. He had been in the industry for 40 years. He had made The Magnificent Seven and The Great Escape, and Our Man Flint, and the long subsequent career of a man who had been one of the most commercially reliable and most specifically distinguished presences in American cinema across 4 decades. He won. The envelope was opened. His name was the name. He walked to the podium at 69 years old, which is the age of a man who has been through what he had been through across the 40 years that had produced the moment. And he received the Oscar with the specific quality of a man who is fully aware of the distance between where he is standing and where he was in 1979 when the rheumatologist told him what was happening in his joints. He was gracious. He was warm. He thanked the people who needed to be thanked. He said what he needed to say. He held the Oscar. He was 69 years old, and he had won. And the night everything changed was 10 years in the past, and the 10 years had produced this. He remarried in 1993. Paula Murad was the woman, and the marriage was the marriage of a man who had been in the empty house long enough to understand what the empty house was and what the alternative to it required. The accounts of the people who knew them describe a relationship of the specific quality that the relationships of people who have found each other after the things that finding each other after requires tends to have, a quality of earned rather than assumed, of chosen rather than simply available, of two people who are in the relationship because they have decided to be, rather than because the relationship was the path of least resistance. She was with him in the career years that followed the Oscar. She was with him when the career continued in the way of the careers of men who have won the Oscar at 69 and who continue to work with the professional seriousness of people who have always taken the work seriously, not coasting on the recognition, but engaging with the subsequent work in the specific way of engagement that the engagement deserves. He worked. He was in films and television through the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. He was, in those years, the version of himself that the 9 years of pain and the night that had changed everything, and the Oscar and the remarriage had produced, older, changed, carrying the full weight of what the decades had contained, and giving the camera the specific quality of presence that the carrying of it had produced. He died on December the 18th, 2002. He was 74 years old. He died at his home in Beverly Hills of a heart attack. Paula was with him. The death was not from the rheumatoid arthritis. It was the heart, in the specific way of the hearts of 74-year-old men who have lived the lives they lived. The arthritis had not killed him. The heart had. This is a fact worth stating clearly, because the story of the diagnosis and the recovery and the night that changed everything sometimes obscures it, and the obscuring of it is a disservice to the accurate account of what the story was. He was 74. He had been given 14 years by whatever the night that changed everything had produced. 14 years of reduced pain and returning function, and the Oscar, and the remarriage, and the continued career, and the specific quality of a life that had been extended past the point that the 9 years of the bad diagnosis and the empty house had suggested were possible. 14 years. He used them. Now, my friend, let me bring the 4 parts of this story together in the way that the bringing together requires. The bad diagnosis, the empty house, the night everything changed. What came after? The bad diagnosis is the story of what the body does when it attacks itself. The specific, ironic cruelty of an autoimmune condition, which is the condition in which the body's own defense system becomes the thing it needs to be defended from. It is the story of what that specific cruelty does to a career that has been built on the specific quality of the body's ease, and what the career does when the ease is no longer available in the form it was available. The empty house is the story of what the same years look like from the domestic side. The marriage that ended in the same year as the diagnosis. The years in the house that was the house of a man alone with the pain rather than the house of a family. It is the story of the private cost of the public condition, the cost that the audience and the critics and the industry do not always see, because it is happening in the house rather than on the screen. The night everything changed is the story of what happens when a person who has run out of the available options decides to try the unavailable ones. It is a story about desperation in the most honest sense of the word. The desperation of a man who is 58 years old and who has been in pain for 9 years, and who is therefore in the specific position of having nothing to lose by trying the thing that the conventional authority has not endorsed. It is a story about the specific form of courage that is not the dramatic courage of the person who does the heroic thing in the dramatic moment, but the quiet courage of the person who tries one more thing when one more thing is all that is left. What came after is the story of what the trying produced. The Oscar at 69, the remarriage, the 14 years, the specific form of the career's second flowering that the recovery made possible, and that the Oscar acknowledged, and that the subsequent work was the expression of. 4 parts. One man, one story. James Coburn. He had the bad diagnosis and the empty house and the night that everything changed. And what came after was worth everything that the having of them required. The movie screen is not the only thing he left. He left the account of what it is to have the bad diagnosis and the empty house, and to make the decision in the night that changes everything, and to live the 14 years that the decision produces. That account is worth more than the Oscar. He lived it. Now you know it. Sleep well, my friend. And the next time you see him, in the Magnificent Seven, the most physically at ease he ever was, in affliction, the most emotionally honest, in the space between those 2 films, which was the space of the bad diagnosis, and the empty house and the night that changed everything, see the whole story. It is one of the better ones, the whole of it.